A whale breaks the surface 50 feet from a small fishing boat and doesn't dive back down. It floats there, motionless at first. Then it starts to roll, again and again, tilting its enormous body toward the boat, lifting one fin clear out of the water. The fishermen lean over the side. There is a net, a thick, tangled mass of rope wrapped so tightly around the animal that it has cut into the flesh. The whale stops rolling and holds still. It waits. And somehow, without a word passing between species, those fishermen understand exactly what they are being asked to do. This is not a story. It happened in the Sea of Cortez in 2011, documented in full by marine biologist Michael Fischbach of the Great Whale Conservancy. The whale was a humpback, fully grown, somewhere between 40 and 50 feet long. It could have thrashed. It could have sounded. Instead, it held still for over an hour, while a team of humans worked to cut every strand of rope away from its body. When the last line was cut, the whale did something the team didn't expect. It swam in circles around the boat for 45 minutes, leaping, breaching, slapping the water with its fins, and then it came back to the boat. It circled each person individually. It did not leave until it had, in some way that defies easy description, acknowledged every human on that vessel. You could call that coincidence. You could say the whale was simply reacting to the removal of pain. But here is what makes that explanation uncomfortable. It came back. It made a circuit of each person. It stayed. This is the question scientists have been sitting with for decades. Why do wild animals, animals with no evolutionary history of domestication, no training, no shared language, choose humans when they are in danger? Not just once, not in isolated cases, repeatedly, across species, across continents, in patterns so consistent that researchers now have a name for it. It is called interspecies solicitation of help. And it is far more common than most people realize. A moose in Alaska approaches a family in their yard and stands still while they remove porcupine quills embedded so deeply in its face it can no longer close its mouth. A crow lands on a busy street in Seattle, waits at a red light, and places a walnut under a car tire, then waits for the light to change, the car to drive over it, and returns to eat what the machine cracked open for it. A badger in Iran follows a group of researchers for 3 days, circling their camp at night until one of them notices it is limping, finds a thorn so deeply embedded it has begun to cause infection, removes it, and the badger leaves and does not return. These are not domesticated animals. They are not tame. They have not been conditioned to associate humans with food. They came. They waited. They communicated something specific. And then when it was resolved, they left. So what is actually happening? Part of the answer lies in what behavioral ecologist Marc Bekoff at the University of Colorado has spent decades documenting: the cognitive and emotional complexity of wild animals. Bekoff argues that the line between human cognition and animal cognition is not a wall, it is a gradient. Animals assess situations, they evaluate options, they choose. And when an animal has assessed its situation and determined that its own resources are insufficient, the evidence increasingly suggests it can identify an external resource and deliberately move toward it. That resource, in more and more documented cases, is a human being. But why humans specifically? You are not the strongest creature in any ecosystem you enter. You are not the fastest. You cannot smell or hear at the level most predators operate. You are, by most physical measures, unremarkable. And yet something about you, your hands, your tools, your tendency to stop and look and respond, has become legible to a growing number of wild species as something useful in a crisis. The most extraordinary documented example of this may not involve a crisis at all. In the forests and savannas of Mozambique and Tanzania, a small bird called the greater honey has developed something that has no clean category in biology. It finds beehives, but it cannot break them open. So it finds a human. It calls a specific distinct call used only in this context, and then it flies, slowly, stopping on branches, looking back. It is, without question, leading you somewhere. When you arrive at the hive, you break it open, take the honey, and leave the wax and larvae, which is what the bird actually wants. Researcher Claire Spottiswoode at the University of Cambridge has spent years studying this relationship and found something that should stop you in your tracks. The birds respond differently to human calls that signal cooperation than to calls that do not. They have learned which humans are useful. They communicate across a gap between species so wide it should, by every traditional assumption about animal behavior, be unbridgeable. And they do it not out of desperation, but out of something that looks remarkably like strategy. This is not instinct in the way we usually mean it. Instinct is fixed. Instinct does not adapt to the presence of a specific human, making a specific sound. What the honeyguide is doing is more dynamic than that, more flexible, more responsive, more deliberate, which raises a harder question. If wild animals are capable of identifying humans as useful and specifically soliciting their help, what does that tell you about what those animals understand about you? Researcher Karen Pryor, who has spent decades studying animal learning and cross-species communication, describes this as a form of behavioral flexibility that wild animals near humans have been quietly developing in response to increasing contact. Animals that live near humans long enough begin to build what Pryor calls a functional model of human behavior, not a conscious map, not language, but a working understanding of what humans tend to do when they observe an animal in distress. And some animals, the ones with sufficient cognitive complexity, have begun to use that model deliberately. Think about what that actually requires. The animal must first recognize that it has a problem it cannot solve alone. It must identify a potential helper outside its own species. It must then overcome what is, for most wild animals, an extremely powerful evolutionary drive, the drive to avoid humans, the impulse to flee that has kept wild things alive for millions of years, and it must hold still long enough for help to arrive. That is not instinct. Instinct would tell it to run. What overrides that instinct is something that looks, from the outside, like a decision. There is another layer to this that is harder to explain, but appears consistently across the documented cases. The animals seem to know the difference between a human who will help and a human who will not. Dolphins have been observed approaching certain fishing boats and avoiding others in the same waters with no obvious physical difference between them. Crows in studies at the University of Washington, conducted by researcher John Marslow, demonstrated not only that they can recognize individual human faces, but that they communicate those identifications to other crows, passing on information about which humans are dangerous and which are not across multiple generations. The concept of a trustworthy human, as distinct from an untrustworthy one, is something wild animals in the right cognitive range can form, hold, and transmit, which means that when a wild animal approaches you in a moment of crisis, when it breaks the instinct of a lifetime and moves toward rather than away, it has already made a judgment, not about humans in general, about you specifically, about the way you move, the way you hold yourself, the absence of threat in your posture. It has processed that information and arrived at something. Frans de Waal, the primatologist whose decades of work on empathy and cooperation across species fundamentally changed how science thinks about animal emotion, argued that the capacity for cross-species cooperation is far older and far more widespread than humans have been willing to acknowledge. The assumption that animals act only within species, only toward creatures they recognize as kin, only within the logic of their own survival, de Waal's research dismantled that assumption piece by piece. What he found was that cooperation, empathy, and deliberate helping behavior appear across the animal kingdom in forms we are only beginning to map. What you are seeing when a wild animal approaches you in distress is not an anomaly. It is the leading edge of something that has been quietly developing for a very long time. Consider the orca. Off the coast of southeastern Alaska, fishing boats have documented a behavior that has no satisfying conventional explanation. Orcas follow the boats to fishing grounds, wait while the lines are set, and then take fish from the lines before they can be hauled in. This is not unusual. It is called depredation, and it happens worldwide. What is unusual is what some of these orcas have started doing in return. When a boat's sonar equipment fails, or when a line becomes tangled in a way the crew cannot locate from the surface, certain pods have been observed circling specific problem areas, behavior so consistent that some crews have begun following the whales to find their own gear. The orca has not been trained to do this. No reward system exists. Something else is operating. You cannot prove that the orca is helping, but you cannot prove it is not. And that uncertainty, that space between what we can measure and what we are watching, is exactly where the most interesting science is happening right now. Now think about the last time you watched footage of a wild animal approaching a human in distress and felt something you could not quite name. That pull, that held breath, the way you leaned in until the rope was cut, until the thorn came free, until the animal turned and moved away whole. You felt that because something in you recognized the structure of what was happening, not the biology, not the taxonomy, the act itself, the reaching across an impossible distance towards something you hoped would help, the waiting, the stillness, while another being decided whether you were worth trusting. That recognition runs both directions. The animal that holds still while you work is extending something toward you that costs it everything its instincts have been built to protect. It is making itself vulnerable to the one thing it has spent its entire life learning to avoid. That is not nothing. That is, by any reasonable definition, an act of faith. A whale breaks the surface and does not dive. It rolls toward you. It holds still. And in the moment before you reach over the side to begin cutting, you understand, without words, without translation, without anything you could put into a sentence, exactly what is being asked of you. The animal chose you. Before you even saw it, it had already decided you were worth the risk.